You did this! Look at the mess!
What happened here?
This is a disaster! She ruined everything!
The proof you needed. What is this? This can't be real, Gunworld.
You lied to me.
I was 26 years old, the night I ruined the most important party of Jun-Ho Baek's life. Before you judge me for that, I need you to know something. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it for money. I did it because for 21 years, a lie had been sitting inside that family like a splinter nobody wanted to pull out, and somebody finally had to pull it out. If you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes, drop a comment right now that says truth. I want to see how many of you believe that before this story even gets started, because by the end of tonight, you're going to need to believe it. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly where it started and exactly how long it had been buried before I ever put on a catering apron and walked into that building. Everybody in this city knew the name Baek. The Baek Group owned half the shipping docks, a chunk of the downtown skyline, and enough real estate to make small countries jealous. But the man at the top of it, Jun-Ho Baek, wasn't known for the buildings with his name on them. He was known for one strange, specific thing. He never laughed. Not once. Not in 21 years. There were rumors about it in every business magazine that ever profiled him. Photographers waited outside his building for years trying to catch one candid smile, and they never got it. A gossip site once offered $5,000 to the first reader who sent in a photo of Jun-Ho Baek smiling. Nobody ever collected. People called him the Winter King behind his back because being in a room with him felt like walking into a freezer. Cold. Still. Untouchable. Employees at Baek Tower had their own quiet folklore about him. Security guards said he arrived at 6 every morning and left after 9 every night, like clockwork, like a man who had nowhere else he wanted to be. His assistants rarely lasted more than a year, not because he was cruel, people said, but because working for someone who never showed a single flicker of feeling made you start to wonder if you were the problem. Board members respected him. Competitors feared him. And not one person in that building could tell you a single thing that made Jun-Ho Baek happy, because in 21 years, nobody had ever seen it happen. I used to think that was just a rumor, the kind of thing tabloids invent to sell magazines. Then I met him, and I understood. It wasn't a rumor, it was a wall. And that man had spent 21 years building it brick by brick around something he never let anyone see. I found out what that something was, and it had my father's name written all over it. My father's name was Elias Bishop. He used to be an engineer for Baek Shipping, back when the company was smaller and the docks were still mostly steel and rust instead of glass and steel towers. 21 years ago, there was an accident at one of the company's cargo facilities. A structural collapse. 3 people died that night, including a woman named Suar Baek, Jun-Ho's mother. My father was the engineer who signed off on the safety inspection 2 weeks before the collapse. For 21 years, everyone believed he missed a fatal flaw in the structure. He lost his job. He lost his license. He lost every ounce of respect this city ever gave him. He spent the rest of his working life fixing washing machines and window units, a brilliant man reduced to a toolbox and a folding table at the back of a hardware store, because a company he trusted let the world believe he killed a woman he never even met in person. I remember him a little from before all that, though I was small. I remember a tall, quiet man who whistled while he fixed things, who kept a notebook of measurements in his shirt pocket at all times, who used to let me sit on the counter and watch him roll dough on Sunday mornings, patient as anything, showing me how to fold red bean paste into pastry the exact way somebody had once shown him. He told me once that a woman at his old job taught him that recipe. A kind woman who brought him lunch on the days the inspections ran long, back when he still wore a hard hat to work instead of a name that made people cross the street. He never told me her name. He just said she was kind to him once, in a way he never forgot, and that the least he could do was pass her kindness down to me, the same way she'd passed it to him. After the accident, that whistling stopped. The notebook of measurements disappeared into a drawer somewhere and never came back out. My father became a smaller, quieter version of himself. A man who apologized to strangers for things that weren't his fault. A man who flinched at the word engineer for the rest of his life. I grew up watching a good man shrink himself down to fit inside a lie other people told about him, and I promised myself, somewhere around age 16, that I would spend whatever it took to grow him back to his full size again, even if I had to do it after he was gone. He died 4 years ago, still carrying that weight, and on his last good day, before the cancer took the last of his strength, he grabbed my hand and told me something that changed the rest of my life. I didn't sign that inspection wrong, Camille. Somebody changed the report after I signed it. I know because I kept my own copy. Find it. Clear my name. Please. I spent 4 years looking for that copy. 4 years of public records, requests that came back redacted or empty. 4 years of cold emails to former bike shipping employees who either didn't remember or didn't want to remember. And 2 months before the night I'm about to tell you about, I finally found a woman willing to talk. Her name was Patricia, and she'd spent 19 years running the archive department in the basement of Baek Shipping's old dock office before she retired. I found her through a community garden club, of all places, 3 towns over, and I sat across from her at her kitchen table for 2 hours before she said a single useful word. She was scared. Not of Jun-Ho, she told me. Of the people who used to run vendor and contracts, and the habit that department had of making paperwork disappear whenever it was inconvenient. I remember your father, she finally said, stirring her tea slower than the tea needed to be stirred. Elias, right? Quiet man, careful. The kind who checked his numbers 3 times before he'd sign anything. I never believed he made that kind of mistake. Structural men like him don't make mistakes like that. Somebody made that mistake for him. Do you know where the original report went? I asked her, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I filed it myself, she said, before anyone got to it. I kept a copy of everything back then, because I didn't trust the people I worked for. Not after I saw how fast paperwork could change once lawyers got involved. There's a storage unit under Baek Tower, basement 2, that nobody's touched in years. If it's anywhere, it's there. She told me the real inspection report still existed, buried in a storage unit the company forgot it even owned, because nobody throws away liability documents, they just hide them. But knowing where a piece of paper is and getting your hands on it are 2 very different problems. That storage unit was inside Baek Tower, and Baek Tower doesn't let strangers wander its basement. I thought about that decision for 2 full weeks before I made it. I sat with the idea of walking into the same building that destroyed my father, wearing a uniform that made me invisible on purpose, gathering evidence quietly instead of screaming the truth from the rooftops, the way some angry part of me wanted to. It felt small. It felt like more waiting, after 4 years of waiting already. But my father didn't raise a reckless daughter. He raised a careful one, the same way he was careful, and careful people build their case before they ever open their mouth. So I did the only thing that made sense. I got a job with the catering company hired for the biggest event Baek Tower had thrown in a decade, the engagement party of Jun-Ho Baek. If you're the kind of person who does whatever it takes when the people you love have been wronged, comment the word family, because that's exactly who I am. And that's exactly why I put on a black and white uniform and carried a tray of champagne into the belly of the company that destroyed my father. The party was set for a Saturday night on the 40th floor of Baek Tower, a ballroom with ceiling-to-floor windows that made the whole city look like a carpet of lights underneath you. The event planner walked our catering crew through the room twice, snapping her fingers at anything out of place. 300 guests were expected. Politicians, business partners, old money families who'd known each other since childhood. At the center of it all stood the woman being celebrated that night, Vanessa Kane, the bride-to-be. Vanessa was the kind of beautiful that made a room go quiet, the kind of beautiful people photograph instead of look at directly. She was also the daughter of a real estate developer who'd been trying to merge his company with Bike Group for 3 years. The marriage wasn't a secret about love. Everyone in that ballroom knew exactly what it was. 2 empires deciding to become 1 empire with a ring as the paperwork. Standing beside her, orchestrating every detail of the party with the calm precision of someone who'd planned a war instead of a wedding, was Renata Baek. Renata was Jun-Ho's stepsister. Her mother had married Jun-Ho's father 8 years after Soo Baek died, and Renata had grown up in that house watching Jun-Ho inherit everything while she got invited to sit at the family table like a guest who never quite belonged. She was 31, sharp as a blade, and she ran the Baek Group's vendor and contracts division, which meant she controlled where a great deal of the company's money went before anyone with real power ever noticed. I would learn later that Renata had spent her whole adult life being told, gently but constantly, that she would never truly be a Baek, not the way Jun-Ho was a Baek, not by blood, not by grief, not by the mother everyone in that company still spoke of in hushed, reverent tones. Whatever she was about to do that night, I understood. Even then, that some small part of it came from 23 years of being handed silver spoon scraps instead of a real seat at the table. That understanding didn't excuse what she'd done. It just made it make sense. The room smelled like white lilies and money, if money has a smell, which in that building it absolutely did. Some mixture of fresh flowers and old wood polish and champagne breathing in crystal glasses lined up in perfect rows. Waitstaff moved along the walls like furniture nobody was supposed to notice, and I learned fast how to become part of that furniture. Eyes down, tray steady, voice quiet, the exact opposite of every instinct I had. I clocked both of them within the first 10 minutes of setup. What I didn't expect to clock, so fast and so hard it nearly knocked the tray out of my hands, was him. Jun-Ho Baek walked into that ballroom 2 hours before his own engagement party, alone, in a black suit with no tie, and the entire room seemed to lower its voice. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He walked to the window and looked out at the city like he was checking whether it had betrayed him yet. He was, I'll admit, nothing like the pictures. The pictures made him look severe. In person, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long, his body had simply adjusted to the weight of it and forgotten it was ever supposed to feel light. I wasn't supposed to look at him. Waitstaff exists to be invisible at events like this, but I looked. Because somewhere under that suit was the son of the woman my father spent his whole life being blamed for killing, and I needed to understand what 21 years of silence had done to him. What it had done, I would learn over the next 6 hours, was turn him into a man who flinched every single time somebody laughed. The party started at 7. By 8, I had already refilled champagne glasses for 3 senators, a Formula Racing team owner, and a woman who kept asking if I recognized her from television. I stayed quiet. I stayed small. I stayed exactly where a waitress is supposed to stay, which is nowhere anyone important looks twice. Except once, near the dessert table, I dropped a fork. It was such a small thing. A single silver fork hitting marble floor, ringing out over the string quartet for half a second before somebody's laugh swallowed the sound. I bent down fast to grab it, apologizing to no one in particular, and when I stood back up, Jun-Ho Baek was looking directly at me. Not through me, the way important men look through waitstaff. At me. "You're new," he said. It wasn't a question. "Started this week, sir," I said, keeping my eyes low the way the catering manager trained us to. "Look at me when you talk," he said. Not unkind, just precise, like a man correcting a measurement. I can't stand people who talk to my shoes. I looked up. His eyes were dark and very still, the kind of still that comes from a person working very hard to keep everything else still too. "Sorry," I said. I dropped a fork. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of one, passing through a room it wasn't allowed to stay in. "Most people apologize to the fork," he said. "You apologize to the floor." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the right move, because he gave a small nod and walked away before I could embarrass myself further. My hands were shaking when I picked up my tray again, and it had nothing to do with nerves about being caught, and everything to do with the strange, unwanted realization that the Winter King had just made a joke, quietly, only for me, and I had almost missed it. I filed that feeling away in a drawer marked "Do Not Open right now," and got back to work, because I had a storage unit to find and a father's name to clear. And I did not have time to be curious about a man whose family had spent 2 decades letting mine rot. He found me again about an hour later, near the balcony doors, where I'd stepped out for 30 seconds of quiet air between rounds of drink refills. He wasn't looking for me, exactly. He was just there, alone, staring out at the city the same way he'd been staring at it when he first walked in. "You don't smile much either," he said, without turning around, like he'd known I was standing there before I made a sound. "Not much reason to tonight," I said, before I could stop myself. It wasn't the kind of thing waitstaff were supposed to say to the man whose party they were serving. He turned then, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not suspicion. Something closer to curiosity, like he'd found an object that didn't match anything else in the room. "Most people smile constantly around me," he said, "whether they mean it or not. It gets exhausting, being smiled at by people who are actually terrified of you." "I'm not terrified of you," I said. And it was true, though not for reasons I could explain to him yet. Something in his face shifted, small and quick, gone before I could name it. "No," he said slowly. "You're not. That's unusual." He looked at me another second longer than the conversation required, then nodded once and walked back toward the ballroom, leaving me alone with the city lights and a feeling I didn't have room for that night. 2 hours later, I got my chance to slip away from the main floor. The catering staff took a break rotation near the service elevators, and I used my 10 minutes to find the archive level instead of the break room. My retired clerk contact had given me a floor number and a rough description. Basement 2, past the old records room, a locked cage with boxes nobody had touched since before Renata Baek was old enough to work there. The basement level smelled like cold concrete and old cardboard, the kind of smell that tells you a place has been forgotten on purpose. My hands were shaking as I worked the lock Patricia had described, an old-fashioned key cylinder nobody had bothered upgrading in 20 years because nobody important ever came down here anymore. Every creak of the pipes overhead made me freeze, certain someone had followed me, certain a security guard was about to round the corner and ask why a catering employee was 3 floors below where she belonged. I found the cage. I found the boxes. What I did not expect to find, tucked behind 3 years of unrelated shipping manifests, was a folder with fresh fingerprints in the dust around it, like somebody else had been down there recently too. Inside that folder was the original safety inspection report, signed by my father, dated 3 weeks before the collapse, showing the structure passed every test he ran. And clipped behind it, a second, altered version of the same report, dated the same day, showing a fabricated set of numbers that made it look like my father cleared a structure with a known defect. 2 reports. 1 real, 1 fake, both bearing my father's forged signature on the second one. I sat on that concrete floor in my catering uniform and cried for the first time in years because I finally had proof of what I already believed with my whole heart. My father never signed off on a defect. Somebody changed his numbers after the fact and let him carry the blame for a woman's death he had nothing to do with. But proof of a cover-up and proof of who did the covering aren't the same thing. I needed one more piece before I could bring this upstairs. I needed to know who had access to alter that report 21 years ago and who benefited from my father taking the fall. I found my answer in the same folder, in a company memo I almost overlooked because it looked so boring. A memo authorizing internal review and correction of the shipping facility's inspection paperwork, signed off by the man who ran vendor relations and contracts at the time. Jun-Ho's stepfather. Renata's father. The man who married into the Baek family 8 years after the accident and quietly built himself into the second most powerful person in the company, using a cover-up that protected the family name and buried an innocent engineer at the same time. He'd died 6 years ago. But the seat he built, the department he built, the entire culture of quietly rewriting inconvenient paperwork so the Baek name never touched a scandal, all of that had passed straight down to his daughter. Renata now ran vendor and contracts. Renata now had the exact same access her father once used to bury my father's reputation. And on my break, going through 3 years of recent vendor invoices that had been carelessly left in that same cage, I found something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with 21 years ago and everything to do with tonight. Renata Baek and Vanessa Kane had spent the last 8 months rooting money out of the Baek Group through a shell vendor called Prestige Event Solutions, a company that existed on paper and nowhere else, billing the Baek Group for services never rendered. Nearly $4 million moved out in small enough pieces that nobody auditing the books would raise an eyebrow at any single invoice. The company footing tonight's party bill, the flowers, the string quartet, the champagne I'd been pouring all night, was Prestige Event Solutions. They were laundering stolen company money through their own engagement party. If you've ever walked into a room and realized everyone around you was invisible to power, except when power needed something from them, comment your city right now. Because that's what that basement floor felt like. I was invisible enough to be trusted with a tray of champagne glasses, and invisible enough that nobody thought to lock a cage full of secrets from someone wearing a uniform. I put the folder in my bag, straightened my apron, and went back upstairs to finish my shift, because I still had one more thing I needed. I needed to see how far Renata and Vanessa were willing to go to protect what they'd built. And I got my answer faster than I expected. I was crossing the ballroom with a tray of desserts when Vanessa Kane stepped directly into my path, her champagne glass tipping just enough to splash down the front of my white uniform shirt. The room around us didn't stop, exactly, but it definitely slowed down, the way a room does when something delicious is about to happen to someone unimportant. "Oh my goodness," Vanessa said, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough for the nearby tables to catch every word. "I am so sorry, sweetheart. Did I do that?" She hadn't apologized to me. She'd performed an apology for an audience. "It's fine," I said, already reaching for a napkin. "It is not fine," Renata said, appearing at Vanessa's elbow like she'd been summoned. She looked me up and down slowly, the same way you'd inspect a stain on a rug you were deciding whether to keep. Whose idea was it to hire staff who can't watch where they're walking? This is a $40,000 dress she's standing near. "I wasn't moving, ma'am," I said quietly. "I was standing still." "Don't argue with me," Renata said, and something in her voice sharpened into a blade. "Do you know whose party this is? Do you understand what it took to put together tonight? And you're going to stand there and correct me?" A woman at the nearest table, silver-haired and dripping in sapphires, leaned toward her companion and murmured something I couldn't hear, followed by a soft, cruel little laugh. Somebody else lifted a phone, angling it just enough to catch the moment without being obvious about it, the way people do when they want a story to tell later without wanting to look like they enjoyed watching it happen. "Get her a new shirt from the back and get her out of this section," Vanessa said, waving a hand like she was shooing away a fly. "I don't want the help looking sloppy in front of my guests." The word help landed exactly where she meant it to land. I felt my whole face go hot, and for one long second I wanted to reach into my bag, pull out that folder, and drop it on the table in front of every senator and business partner in that room. I didn't. Not yet. I needed the moment to matter, not just to sting. "Yes, ma'am," I said instead, and I turned to walk toward the kitchen, chin up, spine straight, because my father raised me to never let anyone see me shrink, even when they were trying their hardest to make me small. I didn't make it 3 steps before a hand caught my elbow. Not hard. Just enough to stop me. "She spilled that on you," Jun-Ho said, quiet enough that only I could hear it, his eyes flicking once toward Vanessa's retreating back. "I watched her do it on purpose." I didn't know what to say to that either, so I told the truth. "It doesn't matter, sir. It's just a shirt." "It matters," he said, and something in the way he said it made me believe, for the very first time that night, that he wasn't just the cold, silent name on a skyscraper. He was a man paying very close attention to a room most people assumed he'd stopped watching years ago. He didn't apologize on Vanessa's behalf. He didn't make a scene. He simply said, "Get a new shirt. Take 15 minutes. Nobody rushes you tonight." And then he walked away like the conversation had never happened. I stood there in a stained shirt in the middle of my father's enemy's ballroom, and for one dangerous, foolish moment, I forgot exactly why I'd come. I remembered again fast enough. Back in the service hallway, changing into a spare shirt, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for a better night. I wasn't going to slip quietly out of this building with a folder and let a lawyer somewhere file a claim in 6 months that some corporate PR team would bury before it ever saw daylight. Companies like Baek Group have 100 ways of making inconvenient truths disappear. I needed this to happen in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of investors, in front of the exact kind of people who could not be quietly paid off or threatened into silence. I needed it to happen tonight, at the exact event that $4 million stolen dollars had paid for. Part of me hesitated. I won't pretend I didn't. Standing in that hallway in a borrowed shirt, I thought about the balcony conversation. about the way Jun-Ho had looked at me like I was the first honest thing he'd encountered in years. And I thought about how what I was about to do would blow apart whatever small, strange thing had just started between us before it ever had a chance to become anything. I thought about walking away instead, mailing the folder to a journalist anonymously, letting someone else's byline do the work while I disappeared back into an ordinary life. But then I thought about my father, sitting in that hospital bed 4 years ago, gripping my hand with whatever strength he had left, asking me to clear his name before it was too late to matter to him. He didn't get to see justice. He didn't get to hear anyone say his name without an apology attached to it. I wasn't going to let fear of losing something I didn't even have yet stop me from finishing what I promised him I would do. I picked up the HDMI cable. The toasts were scheduled for 9:30. Renata was giving the opening remarks as the maid of honor and de facto host, before handing things over to Vanessa's father and finally to Jun-Ho himself. I asked one of the AV technicians, a nervous kid named Dominic, who I'd befriended over a shared cigarette break earlier that week, whether the ballroom's projector screen, the one currently running a slideshow of Vanessa and Jun-Ho's courtship photos, could be switched to a laptop feed on short notice. "Sure," Dominic said. "Why?" "Emergency backup," I told him. "Corporate compliance thing. I'll explain after." He shrugged and handed me an HDMI cable, because sometimes the universe hands you exactly the tool you need at exactly the moment you need it, disguised as a bored 22-year-old who doesn't ask enough questions. At 9:28, I stood at the back of the ballroom in my clean, dry shirt, laptop bag over my shoulder, watching Renata Baek walk up to the small stage, set up near the windows, and tap the microphone twice. If you think you know where this story is going, comment the word reveal right now, because I want you to see if you were right by the time we get to the end. "Good evening, everyone," Renata began, her voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a woman who had spent her whole life learning how to sound like she belonged in rooms that never fully wanted her. Tonight isn't just about a wedding. It's about the joining of two families who have built something extraordinary in this city. I moved along the back wall, close enough to the AV booth to catch Dominic's eye. He gave me a small nod. "My brother," Renata continued, gesturing toward Jun-Ho, who stood near the front with the exact same, still, unreadable expression he'd worn all night, "has given so much of himself to this company since the day our family suffered an unimaginable loss. Everything he's built in his mother's memory." There was a soft, appreciative murmur through the crowd. Somewhere near the front, Vanessa dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin, though I noticed her makeup didn't smudge even slightly. "So tonight," Renata said, "we celebrate not just a marriage, but a family finally becoming whole again." That was my cue. I walked to the AV booth, plugged the HDMI cable into my laptop, and nodded at Dominic. He hit the switch. The slideshow of engagement photos on the massive screen behind Renata blinked once and was replaced with a scanned image of a shipping facility inspection report dated 21 years ago, my father's real signature clear as day at the bottom. The room didn't understand what it was looking at yet, but it noticed. Renata noticed too. Her voice caught mid-sentence as she turned to see 300 guests suddenly looking up and past her, at a document blown up 12 feet tall on the screen behind her head. I picked up a second microphone from the catering station, the one meant for announcing dessert courses, and I walked toward the stage. "My name is Camille Bishop," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I had any right to feel, with my heart slamming against my ribs like it wanted out. My father was Elias Bishop. 21 years ago, he was the safety engineer who inspected the Baek shipping facility 3 weeks before it collapsed and killed 3 people, including Suar Baek. The murmur in the room turned into something else, something sharper. For 21 years, this family let the world believe my father missed a fatal structural defect, I continued, clicking to the next image on the screen, the forged report side by side with the original. He didn't. Somebody altered his inspection after he signed it, forged his numbers, and let an innocent man carry the blame for a tragedy that could have been prevented if the truth had come out. I watched Jun-Ho's face change in real time. Not anger yet. Something closer to a man watching the floor of his own life crack open beneath him. "The man who authorized that alteration," I said, clicking again to the internal memo, "was the head of vendor and contracts at the time. He is no longer alive. But the department he built and the habits he taught it are still very much in use. I clicked one more time. Invoices. $4 million. The shell vendor. Prestige Event Solutions. The exact company that had catered, decorated, and staffed the very party we were standing in. Tonight's engagement party, I said, was paid for, in part, using company funds funneled illegally through a vendor that does not actually exist, set up and operated by Renata Baek and Vanessa Kane over the last 8 months. The room went completely, utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on your ears. Renata's face had gone pale as chalk. Vanessa's mouth had opened slightly, no sound coming out of it. Somewhere near the front, an older man in a dark suit, whom I would later learn was the Baek Group's chief financial officer, had gone very still, staring at the screen like he was doing rapid math in his head and did not like the answer. Behind him, a cluster of investors I recognized from business news segments were already leaning toward each other, whispering, phones sliding out of jacket pockets. A politician near the back, a state senator whose name I'd heard announced at the door earlier, quietly set down his champagne glass and stepped toward the exit, the way powerful people do when they sense a scandal is about to become the kind of thing you don't want your name photographed near. Nobody laughed now. Nobody murmured pleasantries. 300 of the city's most important people stood frozen, watching a waitress in a catering uniform hold a room hostage with nothing but a laptop and the truth. "I have copies," I said, my voice finally starting to shake, not from fear anymore, but from 21 years of grief finally leaving my body all at once. Of both reports. Of the memo. Of the invoices. I've already sent them to 3 independent auditors and 2 journalists who cover corporate fraud, set to publish automatically tomorrow morning unless I personally cancel the release. I didn't do this to embarrass anyone. I did it because my father died 4 years ago, still believing the whole world thought he was a murderer. And he wasn't. I looked, finally, directly at Jun-Ho. "Your mother's death was a tragedy," I said, softer now. "But it wasn't my father's fault. And I think some part of you has always known the story you were told didn't add up. I think that's part of why you never laughed again. Because somewhere under all that grief was a question nobody let you ask. The room was so quiet I could hear the string quartet's instruments still resting in their stands, nobody having the nerve to play a single note. Jun-Ho didn't yell. He didn't storm the stage. He simply turned, slow and deliberate, toward Renata, whose composure had finally, completely cracked. "Is this true?" he asked her. "Just that." 4 words, delivered in a voice so quiet the whole room leaned in to hear it. "Jun-Ho, I can explain the vendor thing. It's not what it—" "I didn't ask about the vendor," he said. "I asked if my mother's death was covered up by your father." Renata's silence answered the question more completely than any words could have. "He protected the company," she finally said, her chin lifting in defiance even as her voice cracked. "Someone had to! Do you have any idea what a lawsuit over a structural failure would have done to us back then? He saved this family. He let an innocent man rot," Jun-Ho said, "for 21 years so that our name could stay clean while his conscience stayed dirty. And you knew, didn't you? You've known this whole time." Renata didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her face had already said it for her. Vanessa, sensing the ground shifting beneath her own feet, tried a different approach entirely. She stepped toward Jun-Ho and put a hand on his arm, her voice suddenly soft, wounded, performing hurt the way she'd performed the spilled champagne earlier that night. "Jun-Ho, baby, none of this changes us," she said. "This is business. This is old business, honestly. And I had nothing to do with the report 21 years ago. I was a child. The vendor thing, that was Renata's idea. I just went along with it because she said it was standard practice. Everyone does it. $4 million is not standard practice," the CFO said from the front row, finding his voice at last. And it was, oddly, the first time all night that anyone besides me and Jun-Ho had spoken up in that room full of powerful people. "That is felony-level fraud, Miss Kane. And I intend to have our internal counsel review every transaction Prestige Event Solutions has ever billed us." "You're overreacting," Vanessa said, and for the first time all night, her carefully composed voice cracked at the edges. Everyone in this industry pads a vendor budget here and there. This is not the scandal you're all making it out to be. $4 million isn't padding a budget, Jun-Ho said quietly. It's theft. From a company my mother helped build. Using a fake vendor at my own engagement party while telling 300 people tonight was about family. Vanessa opened her mouth again, then closed it, seeming to finally understand that no performance, however practiced, was going to talk her out of this room. If you thought this story was going to end with a lawsuit, comment the word Revel again, because I want to be clear right now. Nobody in that room called the police that night. This wasn't a story about handcuffs. This was a story about the truth finally standing up in a room that had spent 21 years sitting on top of it. Jun-Ho pulled his arm away from Vanessa, gently but completely, the way you'd remove a hand that no longer belonged there. "The wedding is off," he said. Not shouted, not dramatic, just final, the way a door closes when it's meant to stay closed. Effective now. He turned to the room. 300 guests frozen mid-breath, watching the most powerful, most private man in the city stand in front of them with his whole carefully constructed life splitting open in real time. "I apologize for the disruption to your evening," he said, and there was something almost formal in it, like a man reciting the only script he had left. "The party is over. Thank you all for coming." He didn't look at Renata again. He didn't look at Vanessa. He walked straight toward me, through the parting crowd, past the untouched wedding cake and the string quartet still too stunned to play, and stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head up to meet his eyes. "Is it true?" he asked. "All of it? Every word," I said. "I have the documents. I'll give you everything. Tonight, if you want it." He studied my face for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like being read cover to cover. "Your father," he said slowly. "Elias Bishop. I remember that name. My mother used to talk about an engineer who brought her tea every morning at the dock office because he said she looked tired. She kept his recipe for something. A pastry. Red bean, I think. She made it for years afterward and never told anyone where she learned it. My chest went tight in a way I wasn't prepared for. He taught her that recipe, I said, my voice barely holding together, because she used to bring him lunch sometimes when the inspections ran long. They were friends, not close friends, work friends. But she was kind to him, and he never forgot it. He taught me that same recipe when I was 12. I still make it. If you've ever found out that grief connects two people who never even knew they shared it, comment your city one more time, because I promise you, this is the part of the story where everything starts to turn. Something shifted in Jun-Ho's face. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't happiness. It was closer to recognition, like a man realizing he'd been circling the same grief his entire adult life without ever knowing there was a door out of it. "I have some, actually," I said quietly. "The pastry. I made a batch for the staff earlier tonight. We're allowed one treat during setup, and I have 2 left in my bag in the back. I wasn't going to bring them out here. It felt wrong, given everything." "Bring them out," he said. I did. I walked back to the ballroom 2 minutes later with a small paper bag holding 2 red bean pastries, slightly crushed from being carried around all night in my work bag, and handed one to a man worth more money than I would earn in 10 lifetimes in front of the wreckage of his own engagement party. He took a bite. I watched his face very closely, because I needed to know if I'd just done something beautiful or something cruel. Handing a grieving man a taste of his dead mother's kitchen in the middle of the worst night of his life. His eyes went distant for a second. Then they went wet. And then, unbelievably, impossibly, after 21 years of photographers failing to catch it, after 21 years of boardrooms and funerals and a lifetime of practiced stillness, Jun-Ho Baek laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It wasn't loud. It came out, cracked and rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in decades, finally swinging on its hinges, half laugh and half sob, his shoulders shaking with the release of something that had been locked inside him since he was 15 years old. "She used to make this every Sunday," he said, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring anymore who saw him do it. I forgot. I actually forgot the taste until right now. Around us, 300 guests stood frozen, watching the Winter King cry and laugh at the same time in the middle of a ruined engagement party. And not one person in that room said a single word, because some moments are too big for commentary. That was the night everything changed. Not just for him. For me too. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I sat on the floor of my studio apartment with the folder spread out in front of me, the real report and the forged one side by side, and I cried until I didn't have anything left to cry with. Not sad tears, exactly. The other kind. The kind that comes after you've been carrying something so long you forgot what it felt like to set it down. Dominic texted me around 2 a.m. Did you seriously just torch the biggest engagement party this city has seen in a decade using MY laptop cable, followed by a string of exclamation points, and then, a few seconds later, proud of you though, for real. I laughed reading it, alone in my apartment at 2 a.m. And it was the first time in 4 years that laughing about anything related to my father didn't feel like betraying his memory. The weeks that followed moved fast in some ways and painfully slow in others. Renata was removed from her position at Baek Group within 72 hours, the board voting unanimously once the CFO's internal review confirmed everything I'd shown them and more. She kept her name, her trust fund, her freedom, but she never set foot in Baek Tower again. And the last I heard, she'd moved to another city entirely, trying to build a life somewhere nobody recognized her last name. Jun-Ho told me once, months later, that he'd offered her a quiet severance and a chance to walk away with her dignity mostly intact on the condition she never touch a company ledger again. He said it wasn't mercy, exactly. It was just easier than hating his own sister for the rest of his life, and he'd already spent 21 years carrying enough hate for one family to hold. Vanessa's family's merger talks with Baek Group collapsed within the month. Her father tried, for a while, to salvage the business relationship separate from the broken engagement. But word travels fast in circles that small, and no company wants to be seen doing business with people connected to a $4 million fraud scandal, no matter how quietly it gets settled. The Kane real estate company lost 3 major contracts within the quarter. Vanessa herself disappeared from the social pages entirely, which in that world is its own kind of consequence. My father's name was cleared publicly within a week. The story hit local news first, then a business fraud outlet picked it up, and within days the headline wasn't about a fallen Mafia-adjacent dynasty or a broken engagement at all. It was about an innocent engineer who'd spent 21 years paying for a lie he never told. Baek Group issued a statement, and Jun-Ho insisted on delivering part of it personally, standing in front of cameras for the first time in his life without that practiced stillness on his face, saying the words my father waited 21 years and never got to hear. Elias Bishop was innocent. He inspected that facility correctly. His signature was forged on an altered report to protect this company from liability after my mother's death. On behalf of the Baek Group, and on behalf of my family, I apologized to the Bishop family for 21 years of silence that never should have happened. I cried watching that on television, alone in my apartment, holding a picture of my father from before the accident, before the toolbox and the folding table, and the years of quiet shame that were never his to carry. I called my aunt right after, the only other family I had left, and we stayed on the phone for an hour, mostly just breathing and crying together, saying almost nothing, because some relief doesn't need words to be understood. Jun-Ho found me 2 days later, not at Baek Tower. At the small bakery counter job I'd taken after the catering gig ended, the one I'd always dreamed of turning into something real someday, if I ever had the money and the time to try. He didn't come with flowers. He came with a folder of his own, this one thin, official, and completely different from mine. I looked into what it would take to open a bakery downtown, he said, sliding it across the counter. Fully funded. Your name on the lease. No strings, no board seats, no ownership stake for the Baek Group. I don't want anything from this except to know it exists. I can't accept that, I said, though every part of me wanted to. You're not accepting a gift, he said. You're accepting an apology 21 years overdue that I happen to be the one delivering. My mother would have wanted her recipe somewhere people could actually taste it, instead of locked away in a memory nobody else was allowed to have. I said yes, not right away. It took me a week of staring at that folder before I finally called him and said yes, on one condition. That he come to the opening and that he bring nothing but himself. He came. Quietly, without cameras, without a suit, in jeans and a plain grey sweater that made him look, for the first time since I'd met him, like an actual 20-something-year-old man instead of a monument standing in for one. My little shop was loud that morning, packed with neighbourhood regulars and curious strangers who'd read about the bakery in a small local write-up, the smell of fresh bread and red bean paste thick in the air, flour dust catching the morning light through the front window. It was nothing like Baek Tower. It was better. He stood near the back of my very small, very crowded, very loud little bakery on opening day, eating a red bean pastry off a paper plate, and when a kid at the front dropped an entire tray of samples on the floor with a loud clatter, he laughed again. Louder this time. Real. Unguarded. It's been 8 months since that engagement party fell apart in front of 300 witnesses and a slideshow of hidden documents. Jun-Ho and I didn't rush into anything, because both of us had spent our whole lives learning the hard way what happens when powerful families move too fast and call it love. We took our time. We let it be slow and ordinary and real, dinners after my bakery closed, long walks where he asked me questions about my father like he was trying to memorize a man he never got to properly thank. I remember one night, about 2 months in, sitting on the curb outside my bakery at midnight because we'd talked so long we lost track of the hour and I hadn't locked up yet. He asked me what my father was like when he laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite kind. I told him my dad used to laugh so hard at his own jokes that he'd have to sit down, that he had this wheezing, undignified laugh that used to embarrass me as a teenager, and that I would give anything to hear one more time. Jun-Ho listened to every word like it mattered, like he was collecting pieces of a man he'd never met to make up for a debt his family owed. Then he told me, quietly, that he didn't actually remember what his own laugh used to sound like before he was 15. He said the pastry was the first time in 21 years he'd heard it come out of his own mouth and recognized it as his. We didn't kiss that night. We just sat there, 2 people who'd both spent years grieving parents in different kinds of silence, finally letting somebody else hold part of the weight for once. The first time he kissed me was 4 months in the flour-dusted quiet of my bakery after closing, and it was about as far from a $40,000 ballroom as 2 people could get, which felt exactly right for both of us. 3 weeks ago, he asked me to marry him. Not at a $40,000 engagement party with 300 strangers and a string quartet. In my bakery, after closing, flour still dusting the counter, with exactly 1 red bean pastry sitting between us and no audience at all, except the ghosts of 2 parents who never got the chance to see how their small, quiet kindness to each other, 21 years ago, would end up saving both of their children. He didn't have a speech prepared. He told me that himself, a little embarrassed, running a hand through his hair like a man who'd planned 100 versions of this moment and abandoned all of them the second he was actually standing in front of me. He just said that for 21 years he'd measured his life by what he'd lost, and that somewhere in the last 8 months, without noticing exactly when it happened, he'd started measuring it by what he'd found instead. He said he didn't want a merger, or a name change, or 300 witnesses. He wanted a kitchen that smelled like this one, and a woman who'd walked into the worst night of his life and somehow left him better than she found him. I said yes. He laughed when I did. Easy, loud, like a man who'd finally, completely remembered how. If this story reminded you that the truth always finds its way home, no matter how many years it takes, and if you believe some people are worth waiting 21 years to laugh for again, let me know in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another truth waiting to come out.